Welcome to the session on building security in, not out. The first presentation is about, if you attended the opening plenary, there was a presentation about the ocean and how we don't really understand all the stuff that the ocean does. It turns out that on the internet there are also different species, and the first presentation is about one of the subspecies you will find, that is grid users, and another one, security people. And it's a great pleasure to introduce Klaus Müller.
Yes, hello everybody, and I'm from DFN-CERT, which is the CSIRT from the German Academic Network. So what we are talking about is a little introduction about CSIRTs and what's happening with grids in Germany. And then I will talk about a lot of the organizational and technical challenges we had when we were setting up a grid CERT capability within DFN-CERT. So first, what is a computer security incident response team, or CSIRT? It's first of all the same as a CERT, an IRT, CRT, SIRT, or whatever similar acronym you may come across. It's mostly because CERT Coordination Center in the United States has a trademark on the word CERT. So they encourage everybody to use the term CSIRT, and it's become since kind of official. So what a CSIRT is primarily the security guys, but their prime task is helping organizations dealing with IT security incidents. So all kinds of hacking, spam, port scans, worm infections, malware download sites, etc., etc. We distinguish a little between local site security teams, which are the security guys sitting at your university or your company, and which are most often part of your local network administration team or your system administration team. Or we have the coordinating teams, which are sitting at an ISP, sometimes integrated with the ISP's abuse team, or we have them as academic CSIRTs, which are sometimes integrated into the network operating center. This is not the case in Germany. The network operating center operates in Stuttgart. We are sitting in Hamburg, which creates another challenge on its own, but I'm not going to talk about this here. And another example is Janet CERT or CERT Coordination Center. So when we're talking about grids and CERTs, it's because 2 years ago or 2.5 years ago, CSIRTs were getting a little uneasy at the thought of what was going on in the grid community. They were having a look at the grid FTP traffic, and at first it seemed undistinguishable from a denial of service attack. They were having a look at something called layer 2 bridges right through the network backbone, and all this were making us a bit uneasy. And for the other part, we were seeing that grids were taking security mostly at the point of authentication and building a very nice and very elaborate public key infrastructure to support grid operations. But what we also saw was that there was little effort beyond that. And so what we saw was that there was a need to bring the CSIRT and the grid people together and to get a closer look at the grids, but also offer them what CSIRTs already had an experience in the security field, like programming best practices, like incident response capabilities. And we were also seeing that some grid people, mostly the people from CERN, were already into that. And we were seeing that they were duplicating a lot of the efforts we had already made at other points. So, and at the same time, so in 2005, 2006, we saw a lot of national grid initiatives springing up. One of them is the D-Grid initiative in Germany, which has now 6, initially 5 community grid projects, which help furthering grid activities in areas like high energy physics, climate physics, astrophysics, but also very interesting operations going on in the medicine and life science, which have completely different sets of requirements from physics, or even in the engineering fields. These people are very keen on things like building digital rights management into a grid structure, which leaves us really scratching our heads. And there was also one integration project within the D-Grid initiative, and this integration project has a lot of tasks, but one of these tasks was setup of grid-specific CSIRT services. And well, as the academic CSIRT, the event CSIRT was a natural candidate for a test implementation. So let's go ahead. When we look at CSIRT services, we typically see a whole bunch of services CSIRTs can nominally offer. Mostly they can be summed up into 2 categories, reactive and proactive services. Reactive is more like an event-driven thing, like reacting on an incident, analyzing the incident, doing forensics, or doing response coordination, like contacting everybody who was infected with a malware, or shutting down a certain port on a network to mitigate a denial of service attack. Vulnerability handling is something very similar. Somebody discovers a vulnerability, and you sometimes have to contact a lot of vendors to get the vulnerability patched and the patches rolled out and quality secured, everything like that. Artifact handling is another activity like this, just looking at what has been left over from some attack, some strange file you cannot make anything of, maybe an encrypted file that is sent to some phishing data site, something like that. Proactive services is mostly trying to make incidents not happen, like promoting secure practices, promoting preparation for incidents and stuff like this. I'm talking mostly about security-related information dissemination. This is actually from a page from the CSIRT Coordination Center. This has a third column. I'm not talking about, there's all sorts of auxiliary services. But the bold blue ones are the ones we are talking when we try to adapt CSIRT services for grids needs. So that means, what do reactive alerts and warnings mean for grid people? I don't think they are really concerned about the next worm that is transported by email, because it's not really of concern to them, unless, for example, this thing carries a Trojan that might someday grab X509 certificates from the users. like a phishing Trojan does today. Incident handling, okay, of course, we have to learn how to detect and analyze grid incidents as a CSIRT. Vulnerability handling is the same. What are grid vulnerabilities? What is grid software anyway? And how to promote best practices with the writers and vendors of that software. And then we have the security-related information dissemination, which means to develop and distribute best practices for grid site administrators, like how to configure the Globus toolkit or EG or whatever in a secure way and not to get into the way of grid operations. So the very first task for every CSIRT, and you can see it in any CSIRT manual, is making yourself known to your constituency. Okay, this seems like a no-brainer if you're already a well-established CSIRT within your constituency. Well, so we thought. It wasn't the case. I talked to one of the research guys who is doing the exhibition here on the floor, and he actually never heard of anything like a CERT at all. And he looked like somebody who's doing research quite for some time. So what we learned was that this being well known does not necessarily extend into all the grid communities that are present in the German Research Network. We are already well known within the local university security teams. Yes, we're around for 15 years now, but we are not well known in the physics communities or in the medicine. So, but we have this nice dgrid initiative that brings all the grid people together in their communities. So we have a platform for exchange, and we can simply go there and make ourselves known. So this was easy. Otherwise, we would have been a very difficult time just to find out where all the grid people are. But, however, this does not extend to grids that are based on an international level. So we still have something to do here. So the next thing is, when we are talking about a grid, is finding security contacts. Typically, you have an incident, which means there's something happening at an IP address, like somebody's doing a port scan or sending spam out. So we then have to find the responsible person or administrative team for that. And this is typically done either by looking into our own database for our own network or contacting the Whois service for that IP address. So, of course, there's no Whois IP service for grids, and there will never be anyone. So, and what we also have to learn was that the grid administrators and the local site security team at a university may or may not be identical. So we have to deal with the fact that there are separate teams at some of these sites. Like we have the computing center for the university, and we have something like the computing center for the physics faculty at that university. So we have to think of a new way how to report incidents to a grid, especially when we think of grid as being just a virtual organization spanning multiple entities. So how do we probably contact everybody in a grid at once? We have a nice proposal by the Open Science Grid in their incident response guide. It's in the paper. So what they basically propose is to create a mailing list, like incident report L at your grid domain, which has probably the name of your grid built into its domain name. So the point about this is that we can automatically reach directly to the grid site teams through that. So this is a nice way when we want to contact all grid sites in one grid at once. However, if we have the traditional way, going by IP address, we will contact the local site security teams. As you can see by the dashed lines, automatic notification here is not given, so this may be a problem of two teams working in parallel but not coordinated. Each one of these approaches has its own pros and cons. So when we report directly through the site security team, we get them involved directly, which is a very nice thing because we won't want to annoy them, like reporting to somebody and not involving them. However, the local site security team database is not often very complete at the CSIRT level. And if we would have every local site security team register their grid networks or net blocks with us, we would become a bottleneck. So this is probably not what we were going to do. When we report through the grid incident mailing list, we have the nice thing that we can automatically inform all the grid members. However, this is of course only going to be as good as the grid's database. And the local site security team may not be involved automatically. And there's a third point, and this is really critical. We must not include anything that gives away the user, the job, or the direct grid site involved in the incident. This is a privacy issue. And it's especially true in the medicine and engineering grids, where the engineers sometimes don't want you to know who is doing which job because the competition might be using the same grid and find out something about your research activities. So we'll probably use both ways depending on the situation, but we have to be aware of some pitfalls with the mailing list approach. So then we have the point of international cooperation. When we established DFN CERT many years ago, we could draw upon the pool of experience from many already existing CSIRTs. So and we try to do this with the grid stuff also, so we try to pull the CSIRT's experience together. We have, as a German team, two opportunities to do this. We could use Terina's task force TFC-CERT for that, which is a European CSIRT forum, quite successful one. And of course, we have the International Forum of Incident Response and Security Teams to do this. And at the beginning of every year, since 2005, FIRST and TFC-CERT have a joint meeting in January. And so this was a great opportunity to initiate a Birth of a Feather session at the meeting in last year. So since then, it has developed into something like a pre-working group stage. And we also made this activity, the grid activity, a part of the TFC-CERT terms of reference. So we try to push this into the international cooperation forums. We had a lot of initial interest, but unfortunately, very little active outcomes so far. But maybe this will change. So, and from the technical point of view, when we want to try to help grid administrators securing their infrastructures, we have to develop an understanding about the software used. So how to safely, securely configure it, how it interacts with other software like web server, the operating system, etc. How to detect break-ins and how to estimate the damage from a break-in. So, and as I said in the cooperation page, this is typically something a CSIRT learns from other CSIRT who have done this already. So unfortunately, nobody has done it yet, at least not in depth. So we have no opportunity of learning from them. And what we also have to learn is that even in the grid communities, very few people truly understand the software. This is mostly owed to the fact that this grid software is still at an evolving stage and sometimes very rapidly changing. So what we then tried was to do some sort of software audit, and we've just looked into what we know about attacks on other systems and tried to extrapolate from here. This works sort of but only with small grid packages like Unicore. For those of you who don't know Unicore, it's a small grid job entry package developed in Germany. And for anything larger, that means G-Lite or Globus, it's way beyond the resources of an average academic CSIRT. I think it's way beyond the resources of most software development teams. So, and also the test setup chosen by us may not be representative of what is actually used in production. So what else can we do? We have some sites in Germany, mostly in Hanover, that operate a grid test setup. And we had the opportunity to do a black box test on this test site. So I did not go very deeply into that. We just wanted to get some basic knowledge about the software. So we started with very basic tools that are in the hands of the hackers also, like Nmap, Netcat, and OpenSSL to get some information about the SSL secured ports. And so what we found out was that it's quite easy to locate grid sites and also to identify to which grid they belong. You just have to look at the SSL handshake of the server, and it gives you a nice list of which client certificates or client certificate authorities it's going to accept. And of course, it has the names of the grid built right into this. And there's nothing of turning this off, because this is built deeply into the SSL protocol. Grid services can be identified even if running on non-standard port map numbers. We have Nmap signatures for our own use. We're not uploading them to the Nmap site. And what we saw was, even with custom Linux distributions, there are services that remain open which are not needed. At least I don't know what finger is needed on a grid site. Or that are configured in an insecure way. Many SSH implementations do still offer SSH protocol version 1, which is really unneeded in a grid context. So with the results of that penetration tests, we would like to use our CSIRT infrastructures for network monitoring. Our idea is that we can directly observe the attackers, or at least suspicious traffic from them, when they try to contact something like a grid. And we can do automatic alerts to our constituency, because we have that built right into our own infrastructure. We could use a network telescope to do this. We have a very small one compared to KIDA, but we can still see some quite interesting things there. However, not much which belongs to grid traffic in any way. And what we are planning is to build up a simple low interaction honeypot. So it means simply having something like HoneyD listening on grid ports, and see what we can see there. And we will then make this HoneyD SSL capable, so to be a more convincing grid honeypot. And we're also working in some hybrid and high interaction honeypot projects. So we may at a later stage have also a high interaction grid honeypot. However that may look like, I don't know yet. So when it comes to software vulnerabilities, I did a quick search of the CVE database and just looking for the keyword grid in it. And well, in 2005, we had just one vulnerability with the SunGrid engine. In 2006, there were already 7. With Globus Toolkit, SunGrid engine, or the OpenPBS and Torque schedulers. So there is a rising activity here. So, and we also see when we're looking at the source code of grid application that this thing is not more secure than anything else. So we must be prepared that there will be a lot of more vulnerabilities coming up. And then there is, of course, all the software the grid software is built upon, like OpenSSL. OpenSSL is a very critical one because this thing does all the authentication in a grid. And this is basically the only layer of defense a grid has. So when you can compromise a web service through the OpenSSL layer, all the bets are off. So, and then there is, of course, Apache or all the nice Java hosting frameworks, Tomcat and whatever they are called, which may be full of vulnerabilities. I'm not quite sure how far this can go. So, but what we saw on the other side was that many grid software vendors do not follow standard security practices. There is often no published point of contact for reporting security problems, like security alert at vendor domain dot something. Or we have no open way of disseminating security information. Most vendors have their own security announce mailing list where they put out, okay, we found a vulnerability here in this and that project or product, like Cisco has, Microsoft has, any Linux vendor has. We see unsigned advisories. I'm not going to push PGP into the grid communities. Sign them with X509 if you must. It's fine for me, but sign them. We have unsigned software packages. I know EG does sign them, but Globus, for example, does not. They published SHA-1 checksums, but this is of very little use if you can compromise, for example, the distribution server and upload your own checksums to it. So we have made some initial contact with some of the vendors, but this remains an open point, and we have currently to live with what we can get. So as a conclusion, we have, despite all shortcomings, become operational in December. And we're lucky, we have only a very few incidents that we could classify as grid-related. Most involve stolen or lost X509 credentials, and we had one false alarm at a cluster site. So on the other hand, many of our community projects are not yet operational. So we hope or fear that this may change in the future. As I said, some of the solutions are not optimal, but in the lack of anything better, we have to do with what we have. And there may be new developments that may change the picture, like the DRM stuff that may be built into this, or some new software, but this remains to be seen. Okay, so I'm finished here. I beg to excuse some of the strange-looking slides. They were converted from OpenOffice to PowerPoint.
Questions? Remarks?
So do you have anything besides email, like telephone trees or anything else, for if the email system is the thing that's been compromised and you need to notify your sites of that?
Yes, we have our own hotline, especially for grid incidents. You can also reach us by fax, or even if you want, send us an old-fashioned email or walk in. These are all the traditional ways a CSIRT offers, and yes, we try to keep a contact database with email or other ways of contacting them, but so far we've needed this only very rarely, and I'm thankful for the fact that the days are over when the police was faxing me like something like 50 pages of log files. Completely unreadable because they copied this from another fax.
Well, you said that you did not include the underlying software in the vulnerability count. But still, if there are vulnerabilities in there and systems get compromised, do you consider that a grid incident, or do you not consider that a grid incident?
I would consider it a vulnerability, which has slightly different ways of handling this.
Sorry, yes, I meant a vulnerability affecting the grid, because an incident and the vulnerability is not the same thing, surely.
Yes. I would like to include at least critical packages like, say, OpenSSH or OpenSSL or Apache for the grid people. But I think that the borderline is very hard to draw, because basically you could include any patch to the underlying operating system. So for a CentOS, that would mean basically every Fedora advisory that comes out.
Why not doing that? I think it makes sense because it puts the grid at risk in a way.
We would really like to leave this to the grid administrators to decide from which source they get this. They could get this directly from us through our own advisory systems, or they could use their local site's advisory system, which is probably having a feed to our own. So, but we don't want to send double advisories to them and spam them with mail. So we see this as a sort of acceptance problem.
I have a question.
Okay.
Given sufficient eyeballs, all bugs are shallow. Do you worry about the limited size of the grid community with regards to the software that's being employed?
In a certain sense, yes, but I'm not really worried about, but what I think is, I do not follow that sentence, all bugs are shallow, because it has been seen in the open source community over and over again that this is not true. Many eyes potentially available do not make secure software. This has to be first and foremost built into the process of writing software. And I am the last who wants to want to pat Microsoft on the back, but they have done a marvelous job in the last 2 years in making at least some of their secure software more secure by building this into their own development process. So I think the more important would be to educate the writers of grid software how to write this software securely, like teaching them what a format string bug or the evil use of string copy is, instead of doing a software audit after the fact.
Thank you. It was great to see someone help the grid people gang up on the sharks. And the same way that you heard about the Danish expedition sailing around the whole world, because it's our planet and it's our network. And one of the important research ships that are sailing the internet collecting information is Kaida. And we'll have a presentation about what happens when you know what's going on the internet.
Oh, is mine not here? Oh, I see. There we go. Okay, so I have way too much to talk about for a half an hour, but I will try not to go too fast anyway. So I was going to talk a little bit about some current network security threats, some things that we've analyzed recently, and then a little bit on kind of the current things we see and where we think things are going. Oh, I'm Colleen, by the way. And a lot of this was joint work with David Moore, who's also at CADA and at the UC San Diego Computer Science Department. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the UCSD network telescope that we have, how we've used it to study some denial of service attacks and some viruses and worm things. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about some botnet things that we're doing now. So the network telescope that we have is basically a big piece of routed IP space that's very sparsely used, so that most of the traffic that comes into it is unsolicited. And it's easy to filter out what legitimate traffic there is. So it gives us a big source of just sort of background noise, garbage, things that are going on the internet. much of which is malicious. Not all, but much of it. So it's good, and also it's good for seeing big things, but not small or targeted events, because it's a look at what things are, targeted at everyone or spreading to everyone, as opposed to something that's a targeted attack against a particular organization. We wouldn't see anything like that. So for worms, this means that we depend on there being some sort of random component in the spread of the worm. So how it works for denial of service attacks is we have this big network. An attacker, if an attacker is doing a spoofed source denial of service attack and they're randomly spoofing their sources, some of the sources are going to come from our address space. So basically, the attacker sends all of their traffic in to the victim. The victim doesn't know that this is attack traffic and responds to all of it. And then we collect these responses that we know are to traffic that didn't go out of our network. So originally, this is back in 2001. We looked at this. We looked a little bit at denial of service attack activity, and then we looked at it a little bit more over time. So this goes through 2002, and the background level has actually stayed pretty stable since then. I was going to demo this a little bit, but we couldn't get the web page to come up on this computer. But if you go to the URL, especially the backscatter monitor, you can look for yourselves. It's a one-day delayed real-time monitor, so that you can see worm activity that we can see. You see denial of service attacks, other things that are going on. So we also can look at internet worms with the network telescope. And when I say a worm, the term worm is used in lots of different ways, and so is virus and everything else. But when we talk about worms, what we mean is something that's spreading randomly without a human component. So I wouldn't think, an email virus that also happens to spread to local network shares as a worm for the purposes of what we do. So that's a distinction that we draw. So basically, for us, an internet worm exploits some vulnerability to spread without any human intervention. And the infected machines continue propagating themselves. So they tend to spread very quickly and generate a large volume of traffic. So it's easy to see how quickly they get infected. So using the telescope, we can study these events in a similar way. So an infected computer is generating these random probes to try to infect other machines on the internet. And since we have 1 out of every 156 IPv4 addresses, plus a little more because we have some other address space we monitor, we see a lot of the worm traffic, as long as the random number generator isn't biased and doesn't have bugs. And it turns out all the ones so far have, but we've been able to compensate for them. I'm not sure if that's a software engineering problem, or if it's just that there's a small amount of space in the worms for the random number generator, and what they do is good enough, because they've certainly worked just fine. So one of the worms that one of the things we've studied most recently was the Witty worm, which was actually relatively small compared to Slammer or some of the other ones. It's from about 3 years ago. And it was in a vulnerability in an ISS, which is Internet Secure Systems, firewall product that people were running on their machines. So it was actually something people had installed to do something good. They were trying to protect their computers, and presumably written by people who had security in mind. So you could imagine that they wouldn't have buffer overflow vulnerabilities in their software, but they did. Basically looked anything that came in on inbound port 4000 could trigger a buffer overflow vulnerability, and that's what the worm did. So it was discovered on March 8th, and the company ISS was privately notified. It was discovered by another security company, interestingly enough. And so they were privately notified, and then the day that the patch came out, the worm also began to spread. So, or the next day, sorry. So it's by far the closest to a zero-day exploit we've seen for one of these widely scanning worms. So what happens when you get infected with Witty? It basically sends 20,000 UDP packets to random addresses that it generates, and then it picks a random device on the machine and tries to write over it. So if that's a write-only device, nothing happens. But if it's writable, then it starts to write over data. So basically, this repeats either until the machine is rebooted or until it's written over enough of itself that it's just dead. So that caused Witty to decay much more quickly than many other worms that we saw. So this is what a typical worm infection looked like Code Red, back from a long time ago. So you can see that it starts out very, very, very slowly and then kind of hits a critical mass, and boom, lots of people get infected. And then towards the end, there aren't that many vulnerable people left over that haven't been infected, so it slows down again because it takes much longer to find new victims. So this is the beginning of the Witty worm. which you will see looks quite different from the others. And that's because there were 110 machines that were basically on a hit list that were all started more or less simultaneously, and they kicked off the spread of the worm. And that helped it spread very quickly, given that it was a relatively small population of machines that was vulnerable. And it's the first time we've seen something like this with a really widespread worm. So we saw the sharp rise in infection with the initial coordinated activity. And then the worm spread peaked after about 45 minutes, which is about 30 minutes later than we saw with other worms like Slammer, which about 10 minutes in, almost everyone vulnerable was infected. But it's still far faster than any coordinated human response as far as patching or even just unplugging machines can happen. Because in that time scale, many people don't know yet that something's happened. And it did generate a lot of traffic. So this is the early growth of the worm. You can see it does level off relatively quickly, within an hour or so. Although cumulatively, we continue to see more IP addresses. And that's partly with new people being infected, and it's partly because of DHCP addresses for infected machines. So you have a continuing infection, but as you get a new IP address, you seem to be multiple machines moving around. So this is kind of the global view, the early growth. You see very quickly everyone gets infected, and then it kind of trails off. You see new bumps every day as people turn on machines that had been previously off, so that basically adds victims into the vulnerable population, and they get infected. But even that dampens very quickly, because machines that have been off for 3 days and turned on, or machines that have been off for 4 days and turned on, there just are less and less machines that fall into those categories. So the Witty worm victim population was interesting. It was inconsistent with many of the past worms because it was globally distributed. And it was mostly home users, small business users that don't have professional system admins maintaining their machines. But it was also very different in that it was a security product that was infected. So this is sort of our gold standard user that has said, hey, I don't know enough about security to take care of my machine. I'm going to buy this third-party software that's going to protect me and run it. And then they were infected. It was also, they infected them via software they ran purposefully. With a lot of the other worms that we've seen, with Code Red, definitely with SQL Slammer, a lot of the population that was infected had the service automatically running on their machine, but they weren't using it. Whereas with with Witty, the people actually were running the software to protect themselves on purpose, and they knew that it was running on their machines. So this is just a little look at the geographic breakdown, and it roughly follows deployment of infrastructure as far as who gets infected and when. It's very different from email viruses, which we'll see a little later. And in the geographic spread, you can see there's a definite time of day skew because a lot of people turn their computers off at night and then turn them on again in the morning. So places where it was daytime when the worm started to spread got infected, and then other places had significant shifts in the number of people that were infected as daytime came and a whole bunch of machines got turned on. And you can see that when you break it down more by region. So the summary was about 12,000 machines in 30 minutes, 11 million probes. We couldn't stop it, and it actually destroyed a number of machines, which the earlier worms had not done. Another interesting thing about Witty is that there's a lot of speculation that it was actually a targeted attack on the company whose product was infected. And so what Witty does is it demonstrates that you can use a worm for that kind of sabotage. They're very high profile, and they get a lot of news coverage. So if you can find in a competitor or in someone you just don't like a vulnerability and then have a destructive worm exploit it, you can relatively anonymously cause them a great deal of damage. So Witty had a lot of sort of novel and disturbing features. Not novel in a theoretical standpoint. They'd all been predicted, but we hadn't seen them in a worm before. So a next day exploit, wild scale deployment. It was successfully exploiting a small population. 12,000 machines compared to the whole IP space is a very small bit. And we worry that it infected a security product. And we also worry that future worms will emulate botnets and be more stealthy and more flexible in terms of what they do. And we've seen this since 2004 when Witty actually happened. It also shows that the patch model of network device security has failed. Right, you can't tell people, hey, your Windows machine is secure because it automatically updates itself. Sign on to the internet with your one click, and that's all you'll have to do. You're going to have a great user experience. Because even folks that are running commercial firewall software on their own are getting infected. And those are the people that recognize that security is important and that they can't do it themselves and they need help. So end user behavior just isn't going to solve the current software security problems. And no amount of pushing responsibility onto them or making them liable for people that break into their machines is going to change that. They just don't have the knowledge or the skills. And they're not able to effectively mitigate current software security problems either, especially when we have near zero-day exploits. So, you know, software vulnerabilities, better infrastructure, that would all be good. So I'm going to switch gears a little bit now and talk about Blackworm, which was an email virus that spread about a year ago now. It was also known as Nixum or Kama Sutra or My Wife. The thing had like 18 names. It would be really nice if we could sort of converge them and know what we were all talking about. So it was a Visual Basic executable email attachment that users ran, clicked on, and got infected. It was malicious. On the third day of the month, it deleted files that people cared about and replaced them with this nicely incomprehensible text string. So who really cares, right? I mean, we've seen a bajillion of these email viruses. But one of the interesting things about Blackworm is that it was one of a small number of viruses that actually phoned home to some place when it infected a computer. And that place was a web counter that had been used like years and years ago and then hadn't changed in a long, long time that was being run. So basically a web page that when you connect to it, it increments the counter that's displayed on the page. So by looking at the page, if you knew what the initial count was, presumably the person responsible could see how many machines had been infected, which was sort of interesting. And logs for the website were available before the first payload destruction, but the URL got publicized. So a large number of people that were not infected went to it to look and see how many people were infected and basically watch the progression. But every time they looked at it, they incremented the counter as well. Plus, there were also a bunch of denial of service attacks that targeted it, which hugely inflated the number of hits. So basically, some of the folks that had the logs and some large ISP folks in the US, ISP people in the US asked us if we could look at the logs and try to reconstruct who we thought was actually infected, because there was a window of time. There were about 2 weeks from when it started to spread to when it was going to be deleting a lot of files that people cared about. And so they wanted to see if they might be able to notify their customers. So that was really the goal in doing this. And for us, it was a unique opportunity to look at the spread of an email virus, because unlike with the network telescope, there really isn't an email telescope where you can get a reliable sample of what's going on with the spread of a worm, or of an email virus, I mean. So you would think log analysis. Well, it's simple. We'll take the logs and look at who connected and count the IP addresses, and we're done. Oh, but I said this. The URL was publicized, lots of people looked at it, and the denial of service attacks added a lot of traffic. So then why not just count all the IP addresses that only connected once? Those are probably the infected people. Except that web traffic aggregators, things like NATs or web proxies that a lot of people use, basically make it look like a large number of infected people are all coming from one location. And DHCP makes it so that multiple computers can have the same IP address at the time that they get infected. So I have my IP address today, I get infected, and I do my one-off connection to the server, and then the next day I have a different IP address, and my neighbor, who's also vulnerable, gets an email from me, they get infected, and they have the same IP address I had yesterday, and they connect. 2 legitimate infections using the same IP address. So what we actually did was first we removed the refer and browser strings set by the DDoS tools. And those were pretty easy to see in the data because all of a sudden we knew what the worm used, and all of a sudden we would see a huge influx of traffic from a bunch of different machines that all had a different browser or refer string. So we were able to remove all of that. And that was actually 91% of the traffic. So the DDoS was contributed a very large amount to what all was logged for the worm. We removed requests for different pages. The logs were not very specific, so pages that weren't the one that the worm or the virus actually accessed. We removed the refer strings that didn't match the one that the virus used. And then we removed requests from operating systems that were not vulnerable, like your cell phone and PDA devices and other things. And this is, we like to pretend that we're doing science. So here are some extra sources of error and uncertainty, things that we don't know about in making our estimates. Like we don't know about infected computers that for some reason the probe failed. We don't know about firewalls or outages that prevented the traffic from getting there. The denial of service attacks when they were overloading the counter certainly caused some probes to not reach the counter. And we don't know, but we can't tell the difference between people who had a vulnerable browser and viewed the page once, but they weren't infected, and people that were infected and sent their one probe. So those were sort of all of our caveats. So for estimating the victim count, we had basically a lower bound, which is for each IP address, the number of vulnerable browser strings that we receive from that IP address. And then the upper bound is the total number of probes we receive from that IP address. And as you can see, it's a pretty wide range. It was between 469,000 and 946,000 people. And it was between 3% and 6% of the original log volume that we saw. But on the other hand, it was enough that we were able to give to a lot of the ISPs, this is the people we think may have been infected, and for them to go ahead and notify even people that weren't necessarily infected but might be, and let them, at least some of them, protect some of their data. So we were glad about that. So overall, you can see that it looks very different from the like the Witty worm graph that I had, where it spikes up very high and then it drops off very sharply. We have an initial rise as it starts to spread, and then it stays more or less constant as people read their email, they get infected, everyone in their email address book gets sent another message, and it continues to go. The viruses have a much, much longer lifespan of time in which they're still infecting machines. And if you break this down by region, you can see that it really tracks even more than the random scanning worms do with the time of day. And that makes a lot of sense because people don't read their email while they're sleeping. They read it, while they're awake. And they're needed to actually click on the link and get infected. The other thing that's sort of interesting that you see with the viruses that you don't see with the worms is language variance, because understanding matters. So you can see that early on we had kind of the Middle East and Asia, and then North America too, where it was spreading. And then we're pretty sure that on the 4th day, a Spanish language variant started to spread. And so we saw a huge influx in Peru, and then the rest of South America took off. We haven't been able to verify that because we've had a hard time tracking down actual copies of the malware, but the data is pretty consistent, and it's also pretty clear that it's not an attack of some sort. And you can see that the countries that end up being very heavily infected aren't necessarily the ones with huge volumes of internet infrastructure like we see with a lot of the random spreading worms that just go out and find anything that's on and vulnerable. The other really interesting thing we discovered was that about 10% of the victims were infected with other things as well that we could see advertised in the browser strings that they used. So botnets and spyware and other things that the machines used whenever they connected anywhere advertising their infection, we could see. And that was an interesting window. It's not very surprising. I mean, you would imagine that the people that will blindly open an email attachment they're not expecting and get infected are also people that will click on random web links and get themselves infected with other things. But it was interesting nonetheless. And I actually have an animation that shows the spread of this worm that you can see on the Cato website. I wasn't able to get it to work on the computer here. But it has, Cuttlefish is a visualization tool we have that basically shows animations over time on a world map with showing the day and night time. So you can see the dark and light as it going across. So it's really great to see for this particular worm because it's only something that people do when they're awake. So you can see, the sun comes, people wake up, there's a huge rise in the number of infections, and then at the end of the day, it goes away again. And that cycle repeats over the course of many days. So go look at it if you want. So conclusions for Blackworm. The log analysis gave us some good insight into the virus once we had done a lot of work to kind of weed out the contaminants. The email viruses spread much more slowly, but ultimately much more successfully and much widely than a lot of the random scanning worms. And the diurnal patterns are much stronger because people read their mail when they're awake. We also saw that the country distribution didn't match deployed infrastructure nearly as much, and that it was strongly based on the social and linguistic ties between people so that they would read open email attachments rather than just network connectivity and the vulnerability itself. And the 10% of victims had the concurrent botnet or spyware infection. And I should point out that that's also a lower bound, right? Many, many more of them could have been infected with things that didn't advertise in the browser strings. That was just all that we could see. So botnets. The big transition that we've seen over the past few years has been from the sort of very open, very obvious email virus and worm kinds of infections that are often for notoriety or for some short-term gain, but really not for any sort of long-term or protracted interest, to more stealthy infection of machines, gathering a large number of machines together that you've infected in a semi-automated way, and then using them to do things like send spam or do DDoS and then extortion from DDoS to make money. And that changes a lot of what people are doing, because when you want notoriety, you want what you're doing to be very obvious and to be noticed. And when you're not, if you're making money off of covert infrastructure, you want stealth to protect your revenue stream. And these are some of the ways that you can make money using botnets. So one of the big transitions that we've seen because of that is malicious software development is now a business, and it's aimed at scalable and manageable distributed systems. There are people paid to develop software and improve it that are not the people that are actually using it to do bad things. And so that makes it much more of a challenge. It's much more of a challenge as far as an arms race goes when you have, seasoned software developers against seasoned software developers, as opposed to seasoned software developers against 12-year-olds in their mom's basement. Also, the coordinated activities are making antivirus activities increasingly irrelevant. A lot of the tests that are looking at just what percentages of malware given antivirus clients can detect are they're getting lower and lower. They're well below 50% now. So antivirus is certainly a necessary and useful thing to be running, but it's by no means sufficient to actually protect people from the things that are out there. And part of the problem with that, too, is that most of the AV companies, when they have a product to sell, so they have websites where you can go and test out. Basically, you say, do a quick scan of my machine and then, oh, I'm infected with some things, so I'm going to buy your antivirus client in order to, delete them from my machine and make it fixed. Well, you can do the same thing if you're developing malware, put it on your computer and find out if the antivirus company can detect it, and when you've tweaked it enough that they can't, that's when you release it. So that's a problem. And we may see some of the demise of signature-based security as we see encryption and automatic, I can't think of the term right now, software that can basically rewrite itself to so that every instance of the same infection looks slightly different. Signatures just don't work very well. And I'm not sure that we're going to be able to win that particular arms race with the current model of security. So that means moving more towards models where, it's behavior patterns or other things. And that's going to be a problem. A lot of the immune system-based computer security hasn't worked very well because what people do with computers changes so quickly. Who would have thought peer-to-peer clients would be as widely deployed and as widely used as they are now? Or streaming video or other things. User behavior can change very quickly, and it's not clear how to make an adaptive system that can keep up. Okay, I'm almost done. This is my last slide, I think. And finally, high system complexity, especially as we have increasingly complex security systems, they're vulnerable to the same software engineering problems that create the bugs that create our security problems in the first place. So when you have the high system complexity, you still have the naive and uneducated users who are not able to secure their systems. It's just not a good combination. So these are some of our current security research. We're looking at Blackworm a little more. We're looking at how long servers that serve spam or serve phishing, that are phishing sites stay up. A little bit of botnet economics, because you'd expect the price of bots to go up if security efforts are successful, and we're not seeing that. And some also worm risk analysis. So with Witty, we've been able to reverse engineer the random number generator and find basically exactly who infected who. So you can see what the liability or what the risks are as for spreading something when you get infected, not just your risks of getting infected yourself. And finally, some anomaly detection to look for small and interesting things in a large volume of traffic. We have some data sets available on our website if you have people that want to do more work. Some of them are freely available, and some of them are available to academic or nonprofit folks, or people or for-profit companies that join CADA to help sponsor our data activities. And finally, we have this internet measurement data catalog where you can get all of those data sets and many more. So that's it.
Questions? Or is every virus clear? Oh, there's a question.
Thanks. You mentioned that some of the malware advertise themselves in the browser string. Have you any idea how common it is? I mean, how large a percentage?
No idea.
And have you any idea why they do it? I mean, it's not really stealth, is it?
Well, with some of the spyware things, like, so if you can compromise a website that you know a user goes to repeatedly, then you know that that machine has been infected. It's often used as a covert channel to report information, because basically if you've broken into a machine and you can make it send a web request, then you can get it to report to you, if you can encode in the browser string, what kind of machine it is, what kind of domain it's on, what software is running on it that you might be able to use, what version of your bot that it's running, that kind of thing. So I believe it's used for information transfer in those ways. But I don't know how prevalent it is. Anything else?
No questions. Our next speaker comes from just across the, well, not the fjord, because it's not a fjord, but just across the water. And he's looked at some smaller sample of the world. So this is a report from just a part of the ocean. Wolfgang John, please.
So my name is Wolfgang John. I'm from the Chalmers University of Technology. And I'm working in a project called MONET, where we do internet measurements in cooperation with SUNET, which is the Swedish university network. And in this particular talk, I want to talk about differences we found between inbound and outbound internet traffic. So I want to start by some introduction about the data we measured and what we are doing in the first place. Then I want to give some highlights about the directional differences we found in the data. Then give the summary of all the results, which is also published in the paper you can download on the homepage. And I want to finish with some conclusions we draw of all this analysis. So maybe I don't need to motivate too much for an audience like here why internet measurement is interesting in the first place. Well, it's good to understand the nature of internet traffic, and we also want to find and to quantify how different protocol features are really deployed. And that's interesting for different communities all working with networking. So modeling, you have network engineers and protocol developers which might be interested in this kind of information. But nonetheless, it's also interesting for network security and intrusion detection people, we believe. So how come that we looked at directional differences on backbone traffic? Well, in a very early analysis of our data, we did very simple backend header analysis, and it was quite evident that on the two links, we saw quite some differences in pretty much any respect. And also we did a very naive analysis of just counting SYN packets and reset packets and see if it matches what you would expect from a DCP behavior, and it did not match at all. So we thought, okay, if we correlate the packets into flows and connections, this might reveal interesting reasons for the differences, which might in their turn show what is really changing traffic and changing behavior of traffic. There's no real related work to what we did. I mean, there's a lot of analysis of backbone traffic, but most of the papers or previous work dealing with directional differences is working on unidirectional flow data, typically net flow. And then it's either on a very low aggregation level on one campus or one university side, or very high aggregation level, so on the Sprint backbone, a tier 1 backbone provider, which is quite large aggregation level. And discussions about directional differences are very marginal in these papers. So we thought, well, could be interesting to contribute something in this spot. So what we try to provide is a more complete view about the differences we found. We have our own data, and I think it's always interesting to have updated contemporary data from a new spot in the internet. Since we can do a complete packet level analysis, since we have all the packet header information stored. So by this we can reconstruct the bidirectional DCP connections out of this bunch of data. And we believe that our measurement location is quite specific in the sense that it provides a medium aggregation level, and it seems to be quite suitable for highlighting these directional differences. To show this measurement location, I prepared a very simple view with all these sophisticated pictures about networks the last days. So I try to have a much more simple view of a network. That's how we see our measurement location. So SUNET basically is a ring architecture, so this should represent this ring, where there is the internet exchange point for SUNET is centrally in Stockholm. And we are sitting in Gothenburg, where you have a own small ring, including two major universities, quite a large student network, and also a local exchange point with regional ISPs. So of course, basically these regional ISPs are part of the internet themselves. But from our point of view, very simple scene, so Gothenburg is like the inside from where we measure, and you have outside is the rest of the world, the internet. So that's the link where we tap, and that's also the link where 90% of all the Gothenburg traffic is routed to the internet via Stockholm. And here on this location, we tap the links for both directions. We are talking here about 2 10 gigabit links. So in order to keep up with these speeds, you need special hardware, which we found in the NDA stack cards. The 2 cards sit in 2 computers, and the cards are tightly synchronized to each other, which is quite important when we want to re-establish TCP connections and stuff. And due to privacy concerns, we are just allowed to capture header data. So we also need to anonymize IP addresses. So this was some limitations to our analysis possibilities. So we did our first measurement campaign, and this is also the data I'm talking here about, is data from 20 days in April 2006. We ended up with 146 traces of 20 minutes duration, and all these 146 traces consist of 10.7 billion frames carrying 7.5 terabyte of data, so it's quite a fair amount of packet headers we stored finally. To give some feeling about what kind of data this is, it's mainly IPv4 data, so there's no native IPv6 spoken. The 0.1% missing are routing protocols. TCP is both in packets and in terms of data the dominant protocol, so it seems to be quite natural that looking on TCP reveals a lot about when we talk about these directional differences we were searching for. But looking at the both links, data and packet counts were quite equal on both links. So from a very high level view, it looked very, as you would expect it from a backbone traffic, basically. So to give some feeling about the aggregation level, I have prepared this table with distinct IP addresses seen. The numbers here are in millions. And this not only should give you a feeling about the aggregation level, it also highlights some of the main differences I will come to later. On the outbound link sources and inbound link destinations are what we consider to be inside our network, and vice versa is outside. So the first surprise was that the numbers are very large, considering that the 3 main networks inside the area of Gothenburg each consist of 7,000 hosts. So we would have expected numbers between 20, 30, 40,000. But these are 630,000 hosts talking inside. And it's even more dramatic for looking at outside. So 22 million different IP addresses are seen. If we look at which distinct IP addresses talk different transport protocols, it's evident here that inbound destinations are significantly larger than outbound sources. And this turned out to be mainly due to incoming scanning campaigns. So the whole IP ranges of the popular universities are scanned entirely, and on the backbone link, these appear as distinct IP addresses. On UDP level, finally we see where all these outside IP addresses come from. So this is mainly due to traffic talking UDP, and I will come back to this later, but this is a UDP, a peer-to-peer file sharing artifact. So as I said, we tried for TCP, we did it to reconstruct TCP connections, where we define a TCP connection as usual by default, also 5 double, but TCP is already given, so it's a port, a destination IP and port number, and the same for the source, which defines a TCP connection. Each of these TCP connections starts with a SYN packet, and if you see a consecutive SYN packet in the same tuple, we define it as a new TCP connection. But there's no timeout in our case. So with this definition, we ended up with 72 million TCP connections seen, where there is an initial SYN packet. And outbound and inbound in this case means that, I mean, of course, a TCP connection needs to carry data in both directions on both links. But the outbound connection was initialized from the inside to the outside. So the first SYN packet was sent on the outbound link, and the same is for the definition for inbound connections. So it appears that there is a quite large amount of inbound connections compared to the outbound connections. Well, we tried to divide all these TCP connections into rejected and established connections, where the rejected connection never really sees a complete three-way handshake. The established connection does the three-way handshake, and the rejected connection is just a SYN packet, and the three-way handshake never takes place. So it turns out that that finally explains the big difference we saw between inbound and outbound number of connections, that inbound connections are mainly rejected connections in some way. And we subdivided rejected connections further to, well, scanning, which means you see a SYN packet without any reply. This doesn't necessarily have to be scanning. It could also be just someone trying to connect to a web server which doesn't exist anymore or whatever. But it turned out that it is mainly scanning, especially on the inbound link. The other two reasons could be asymmetric traffic, which clearly never has a chance to establish a three-way handshake because it's asymmetric. And then there's some connection attempts immediately resetted with a reset packet. But that's happening in a minor extent compared to the incoming scanning campaigns. Even more interesting, we also looked at termination behavior from established connections. I broke down the most common cases of connection terminations we found. So first of all, it's just 22 of all these 70 million connections really established a connection, so are really supposed to be TCP connections. And here suddenly outbound TCP connections seem to be more common compared to inbound connections. And it was quite interesting to see that just around 67% of all the connections close with properly according to standards, with 2 FIN packets back and forth. And that means also that 33% of all the connections are closed somewhere involving a reset packet. And that shouldn't be like this. There is work done already on this subject suggesting that, well, reset packets seem to be quite a common way to close TCP connections, but it was not indicated in the same extent as we saw it here. So in some way, single reset packets are still default behavior or according to standards, that's what you can do, but all the rest of this combination, sending FIN and reset packets, especially in the same direction, seems kind of weird. And that's also where we found quite the interesting difference between outbound and inbound traffic. When connections close with a proper handshake, as a FIN back and forth, and then additionally, the party who closed the connection first is immediately after the last FIN packet following with a reset packet. And this is especially evident on connections open from the outside to some hosts inside Gothenburg, the area of Gothenburg, and then by these servers closed by FIN and reset packet at the same time. So you might ask yourself, why is someone doing this? And look at the port numbers of applications who did this. It seems to be mainly peer-to-peer applications, and they are doing it in order to, at the end of a TCP session, you have the time wait state where you need to keep the socket information for, it depends on operating system, but a couple of minutes. And if you close the connection by reset, you're allowed to release the memory basically. So they try to be very cheap in this respect and very optimized for a lot of connection and want to get rid of the connection as soon as possible. So that's basically where this behavior stems from. We also took some look at statistical properties of these established TCP connections, like statistical properties like connection lifetime, data volume, packet counts. A very high-level overview of the things we found is that inbound connection, so again, connections established somewhere from the outside to a server inside Gothenburg, first of all show lifetimes, more lifetimes between 1 and 5 seconds. And that's not very surprising, thinking of all the incoming attacks. And these are login attempts to SSH or mail where you establish a TCP connection, but then on application level you are rejected anyhow. So that's where these short connections stem from. But on the other hand, these inbound connections tend also to be longer lasting. They carry more data, they carry more packets, and they show a higher asymmetry. By asymmetry in the connection, I mean the typical client-server pattern you would expect that you send a rather small request and get a lot of data, or at least more data back. And this is more pronounced for incoming connections. And the last 3 of these bullets are, again, artifacts of peer-to-peer traffic. So peer-to-peer traffic tends naturally to be long-lasting because they carry a lot of data, and that also explains this asymmetry. And if you remember, I showed that there were more incoming traffic, so there was an imbalance in the number of connections for outbound and inbound connections, and the difference is that inbound connections carry more data, finally cancels out on this very high level view when you just count packets and data, where we had equal counts on both links. So since peer-to-peer traffic seems to be one of the main influencing factors of traffic, at least how we found it, we tried to quantify the number of peer-to-peer traffic according to some very simple and naive port number analysis. And since we don't have any payload, we can not use any signature matching methods, and literature says that just looking at port numbers is quite a huge underestimate with factor 2 to 3. So anyhow, the numbers we can provide here show that inbound connections are twice as likely to carry peer-to-peer, to our peer-to-peer connections compared to outbound connection. And that explains a great deal of the differences we saw between the 2 directions. There was also quite some interesting things to find on UDP level. For UDP, you cannot talk about UDP connection because a connection establishment never happens. So we define UDP flows. And these UDP flows don't have a timeout. We just use the 20 minutes duration of our traces as a natural timeout. So any packets going back and forth between a for tuple are counted in the same UDP flow. But according to this definition, we found these 68 million UDP flows in our 20-day data. And even though we have this very generous definition of a flow, we found that 51 million of all these flows carry less than 3 packets and are very short-lived. So this was a little bit surprising. But then we thought, well, that's what typically DNS or NTP would do, so small short requests. Since for these traditional UDP services, port numbers classification is supposed to be quite accurate still, we believe in these numbers and see, well, DNS and NTP is a very minor part of all this UDP traffic we saw. So we continued to look, and it turned out that, well, also on UDP level, you have, of course, scanning, again, mainly on the incoming link. And in this case, this is around 8%. It's very hard to really distinguish what is scanning, what is something different. But looking at well-known port numbers for UDP scanning campaigns, we can at least give a lower bound of 8%. But that's not all. A majority of these short-lived and small flows is some kind of peer-to-peer overlay traffic from all kinds of peer-to-peer protocols. So looking a little bit deeper into it, it is peer-to-peer signaling traffic, and as one example, you have quite commonly implemented in pretty much all modern peer-to-peer applications, distributed hash tables, like Kademlia, I think would be the most prominent one. And they are updating the routing tables in decentralized way, and this is among other things done with periodic ping queries and replies on UDP level. So a query and a reply shows up as short flow in our definition. And since these peer-to-peer overlay networks span the entire globe, and well, peer-to-peer peers are workstations and not servers, so they're very unreliable, and there is very high fluctuation in these peering partners. So this finally explains the very large number of IP addresses we saw, especially on UDP level. This does not necessarily mean that these IPs, being somehow part of the overlay network, really transfer data. This might be the case, but it's more setting up the overlay network, and data traffic is not necessarily a part of this. So after these highlights of differences we found, I want to give a list of all the differences we found on the 3 protocols levels we looked at. As I said, on a very high level view, we had equal counts on both links. So this was very boring, you could say. But then looking at the details, we found artifacts of peer-to-peer traffic in IP packet sizes. So there seems to be a new, looking at the packet size distribution, there's one step at packets for 628 bytes. And that's peer-to-peer applications trying to send 2Ks of data. And since a full-size packet typically is 1,500K, 1.5K, you send one packet with 628 after this. And we saw this is quite a big step for outgoing packet sizes. Then we found differences in the number of how common IP fragmentation is. And it seems that IP fragmentation on our links is to 90% happening on the incoming links. So outgoing, there's almost no IP fragmentation done whatsoever. In general, numbers for IP fragmentation are very, very small. So then, as I pointed out earlier, there's an imbalance in the number of TCP connections. Connection establishment and termination seems to be quite influenced by peer-to-peer traffic and also by malicious traffic. TCP option usage is really quite a big difference. So there's like 50% more usage of some options for this incoming traffic, probably in order to optimize download speed. And then, as I mentioned, for statistical properties, TCP connection properties are quite influenced by peer-to-peer traffic as well. And finally, UDP scanning is almost only happening on incoming traffic on our links, at least. By this, I want to give some conclusions of what are the things we learned out of all this. Well, for us, we learned that very high-level analysis and just looking naively on SNMP statistics or something might not reveal anything. But the more you go into detail, the more interesting things you might find. And clearly, there are 2 main reasons for these directional differences. And that's, first of all, malicious traffic. So it is a way of trying to quantify of how much more unfriendly is the internet compared to a typical, we are kind of a hybrid network. We are not really just an academic network because we have this local exchange point also. So this means that also some traffic from private ISPs is routed via our links. But we are still more an academic network, I guess, including all the student housings. And as a second source of these directional differences, we found peer-to-peer file sharing traffic. It turned out that in our special case, Gothenburg is definitely a peer-to-peer source, so it's exporting much more peer-to-peer data than it's importing. And that's the reason why we found these interesting differences on our links. If Gothenburg would have been just ordinary contributing to the peer-to-peer community, we wouldn't have seen these differences in that way. And well, peer-to-peer traffic is changing traffic characteristics in, for us at least, some surprising way. So we wouldn't have expected to see differences in packet size distributions or differences in the usage of TCP options just as a reason for peer-to-peer traffic. And also the TCP termination behavior is clearly influenced by peer-to-peer traffic. Yes, with this I want to, that's basically it, and I'm happy to answer questions.
Given the way that you've defined a connection as being starting with a SYN, you may in fact be overestimating the number of connections you have with the resets. And the reason for that is that an out-of-the-box Windows XP stack, if you connect to something, you send a SYN, it sends back a reset. It in fact takes no notice and just sends another SYN, which sends back another reset, and you get 3 SYNs and 3 resets being swapped. This is not correct behavior by Mr. Microsoft, but it is what it's doing at the moment.
Yeah.
Interesting, the only reason I came across this is because I spend a lot of my time at the moment looking at phishing websites, and some of the phishing websites returning a reset if they're busy. And I was trying to work out why it was that my Internet Explorer usually managed to look at these sites and see what was on them, whereas my rather simple-minded Perl running on FreeBSD was failing to look at the sites and get anything back from them. And it turns out that Microsoft are being robust at looking at phishing websites, which is probably also not the best of things for Mr. Microsoft to be doing.
Thank you very much for this comment. So I can imagine that, I mean, it's our definition of a connection, and it might be biased in some way, but then we need to find a definition we use. And we came up with, in order to quantify all these like scanning attacks, we need to start a new connection with a SYN. If we just put it in the same bucket, we wouldn't get this granularity. So, but thanks for the comment.
Is it a fair conclusion to say that your part of the internet, the one inside, is less unfriendly than the rest of the world?
I believe so, for our point of view, yes. So, because I mean, we just have one connection to the internet, in and out. So, and if we see more malicious traffic coming from the inside, from the outside to the inside, so how can I not conclude like this? Or maybe I'm misunderstanding your question.
I think you don't. If that's the case, I think it's a fair conclusion, and I like the message because I'm from an academic network as well. Mm-hmm. And I think we are doing a good job, but I'm not certain about it on a quantitative level.
I think the reason why our area is more friendly is just because it's well configured, and I mean there are policies even for the student networks. If they're doing scanning campaigns, they are shut out of the. I mean their IP address is turned down and stuff like that. But of course we are part of the internet. But since we just have one connection to the internet, everything going to and from the internet is tapped on our links. So I think we can make this conclusion. Yes.
Okay, I like that one.
Which tools did you use analyzing this huge amount of data?
So for collecting the traffic, we use tools from Qaeda and the tag tools, which are provided by NDES directly. Then we did a fair amount of trying to get some confidence in this data, and there's a lot of checking in the sanity of these traces. And there's a quite number of traces we needed to reject because there were some errors. And we just took those traces where we can be sure that they work. And then we were writing our own software doing all the analysis and then storing the per connection data in a database. So the analysis, the final analysis is done on a database level because, well, it gives quite some flexibility in looking at the data again and again from different perspectives, where all this, yeah, I think it's 1 terabyte of header data is not really handy to look at. Thank you.